The photograph appears at first glance entirely ordinary. Shot through the window of a moving passenger car, it shows a flatbed transporter rolling through a provincial Ukrainian town in the early hours of the morning. The image is slightly blurred by motion, the frame canted by the angle of the shot, but centered in the frame, resting on the low loader's bed, sits a vehicle that should not exist in eastern Ukraine on that date. It is a Buk surface-to-air missile system, a tracked launcher carrying 4 ready-to-fire missiles in their characteristic rectangular tubes, the radar mast folded down for transport. The launcher's hull bears a tactical number. If you can read that number, you can follow it home. This is where the investigation begins. Not with intelligence agencies, not with classified satellite imagery, not with signals intercepts shared between allied governments. It begins with a photograph posted to social media by a woman standing at the roadside in the town of Luhansk, watching an unusual convoy pass. She posted it to a Russian social media platform at 7 o'clock in the morning on July 17, 2014. She had no idea what she had documented. By the time anyone understood the significance of that image, 298 people would be dead. Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 took off from Amsterdam's Schiphol airport at 10:31 UTC on July 17, 2014, bound for Kuala Lumpur. The Boeing 777 carried 283 passengers and 15 crew. It was cruising at 33,000 feet over the eastern Ukrainian Oblast of Donetsk when, at approximately 13:20 UTC, it ceased to exist. Radar contact was lost, communication stopped, debris fell across 50 square kilometers of farmland, sunflower fields and small settlements in territory then controlled by Russian-backed armed formations that had seized the region months earlier. Within hours, the volume of denial was already extraordinary. Russian officials suggested the aircraft had been shot down by a Ukrainian military jet, then by a Ukrainian Buk missile battery. Then the story shifted to claim the whole matter was a Ukrainian provocation. The armed formations controlling the crash site initially claimed responsibility on social media, some posts celebrating the destruction of what they apparently believed was a Ukrainian military transport. Before those messages were quietly deleted, the Russian government's position hardened into categorical denial. No Russian military hardware had crossed into Ukraine. No Russian military personnel had been involved. This denial would hold, officially, for years. It would not hold forever. The people who broke it were not intelligence analysts with security clearances. They were researchers working from publicly available information, applying systematic methods to the photographs, videos, and geolocation data that ordinary civilians had captured and shared in the hours surrounding the disaster. The organization that led this work was Bellingcat, founded by British journalist Elliot Higgins, which had already established itself through open-source investigation of the conflict in Syria and the early stages of fighting in eastern Ukraine. Within days of the MH17 shootdown, Bellingcat's researchers began collecting every photograph and video clip they could find, showing military vehicles moving through the Donetsk region in the days around July 17th. They were looking for a Buk launcher. The wreckage investigation by Dutch and Australian authorities had already established that the weapon used against MH17 was a 9M38 series missile fired from a Buk system. The question was where that system had come from. The early framework for understanding what happened was built around a specific vehicle. Ukrainian social media monitoring had identified photographs of a Buk launcher on the move through separatist-controlled territory. Bellingcat researchers cross-referenced dozens of photographs and videos, looking for consistent visual details, markings, damage, identifying features that would let them determine whether multiple sightings showed the same vehicle or different ones. What emerged was a forensic portrait built from fragments posted by hundreds of people who had simply recorded what they saw. The vehicle that kept appearing had a tactical number, 332. It appeared in Donetsk city, moving through the streets in a convoy. It appeared in photographs shot from apartment windows and from roadside positions. The number was visible, sometimes partially obscured, in enough frames that it could be read with confidence, and that number was significant because it matched markings on Buk launchers documented at a specific Russian military installation. The 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade is based in Kursk Oblast in Russia. It was, by 2014, operating the Buk M1 variant of the system. The unit's launchers had been photographed during military parades and exercises inside Russia. Images publicly available and widely shared on Russian military enthusiast forums and state media. Bellingcat's investigators began the painstaking process of comparing the vehicle seen in eastern Ukraine with vehicles documented at the Kursk base. The comparison was not trivial. Buk launchers look broadly similar to one another. The distinguishing details are in the specifics: dents, scratches, unusual wear patterns, non-standard modifications, the precise configuration of external fittings. On the launcher photographed in eastern Ukraine, researchers identified a distinctive feature: a section of spare track links mounted on the vehicle's hull in an unusual configuration, and a set of specific surface markings and scuffs that corresponded to Launcher 332 as documented in Russian military imagery. The conclusion, stated carefully and with attribution to the visual evidence, was that the launcher seen moving through eastern Ukraine was the same vehicle assigned to the 53rd Brigade. According to Bellingcat's analysis, which they published and documented step by step, it had travelled from Russia into Ukraine. The route the investigators reconstructed was based entirely on photographs and video captured by civilians. In the town of Donetsk, an amateur video showed the launcher moving through a residential neighbourhood. The researchers used building facades, signage and street furniture visible in the background to geolocate the shot. Geolocation of open-source imagery is a methodical process. Analysts identify fixed reference points in the frame: a distinctive building, a road junction, a tree line, a rooftop silhouette, and match them against satellite imagery, mapping platforms, or historical street-level photography. When enough reference points align, the position of the camera and the subject can be fixed with high confidence. Bellingcat had developed this technique through extensive practice on Syria, and they applied it systematically to every image they found showing the convoy. One geolocated photograph placed the launcher on the outskirts of the town of Torres in Donetsk Oblast during the morning of July 17th. Torres sits approximately 60 kilometers from the crash site of MH17. The timing placed the vehicle in that area hours before the aircraft was shot down. Another set of photographs and videos captured later the same day showed a Buk launcher moving in the direction of Russia, this time with one missile missing from its launch tubes. A 4-missile launcher had been photographed moving east. The same launcher, identifiable by the same distinguishing marks, was later photographed with only 3 missiles remaining. One had been fired. The significance of that detail is difficult to overstate. It was not an assertion by a government or an intelligence service. It was an observable photographic fact. A launcher moved into eastern Ukraine carrying 4 missiles and was photographed returning toward Russia carrying 3. In the territory it had traversed, an aircraft had been shot down by a Buk missile. The evidentiary chain was not closed by a classified document. It was closed by photographs posted to social media by civilians who did not understand what they were witnessing. Bellingcat published its initial findings in a series of reports in 2014 and expanded the investigation through 2015 and 2016. The methodology was transparent. Every source image was cited, every geolocation step was explained. Every comparison between the eastern Ukraine sightings and the Kursk Brigade documentation was laid out for readers to examine and challenge. This transparency was a deliberate choice, grounded in the understanding that the credibility of open-source investigation depends on its reproducibility. Any reader with access to the same public sources could, in principle, verify every link in the chain. Critics, particularly from Russian state media and government channels, attempted to challenge the findings. Some argued that the photographs had been manipulated. Bellingcat responded by explaining in detail how to verify the provenance of each image through platform metadata, publication timestamps, and cross-referencing with other independently captured images of the same events. The core methodology held because it was based on multiple independent sources converging on the same conclusion, not on any single piece of evidence that could be dismissed in isolation. The response from Russian officialdom also illustrated a critical aspect of digital age evidence: The internet does not forget cleanly. When investigators searched for the original social media post that showed the book Convoy, they found that many had been deleted, apparently by the original posters, after it became clear that authorities might be interested in who had been photographing military hardware. But deletion from a platform does not equal deletion from existence. Researchers used web archive services, cached versions stored by search engines, and copies shared and reshared by other users to recover posts that their original authors had believed were gone. The attempt to erase the digital record had failed, because the record had already propagated across too many nodes to be cleanly removed. One of the most significant contributions to the investigation came from a nighttime video of the convoy passing through another town, which captured enough detail about the positioning of the launcher's external components to allow investigators to determine the direction of travel and approximate the time. Combined with the earlier geolocation data, this allowed Bellingcat to construct a complete timeline of the launcher's movement through the region, from the Russian border through Donetsk to the area near Pervomaisk and back. The Joint Investigation Team, or GT, is the body of national police and prosecutorial authorities from the Netherlands, Australia, Belgium, Malaysia and Ukraine that was formally established to conduct the criminal investigation into the MH17 shootdown. In May 2016, the GET held a public press conference presenting its preliminary findings. The team had concluded, based on its own independent investigation using both classified intelligence and open-source evidence, that the aircraft had been shot down by a Buk missile fired from a field near the village of Pervomaisk in the Donetsk region, and the team confirmed specifically that the launcher had come from the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade of the Russian Armed Forces. The GITI statement was not a simple adoption of Bellingcat's findings. The team had conducted its own parallel investigation using resources unavailable to open-source researchers, but the alignment between the GITI's independent conclusions and the Bellingcat analysis validated the methodology in the strongest possible terms. An official criminal investigation, operating with the full powers of multiple national governments, had reached the same place through a different route. The convergence was not coincidence. In 2019, the GIT announced that it had identified 4 individuals as suspects in the criminal prosecution of the MH17 case. 3 were Russian nationals, Igor Gherkin, Sergei Dubinsky, and Oleg Pulatov, and 1 was a Ukrainian national, Leonid Harkin. Gherkin, also known by the nom de guerre Strelkov, had been a senior commander of Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine and had previously served in Russian federal security structures. Dubinsky had a background in Russian military intelligence. The indictments rested on evidence that these individuals had been involved in requesting, transporting and deploying the Buk launcher and in communicating about its use. The Dutch criminal trial against the 4 suspects proceeded in absentia. Without the defendants physically present, none of the Russian suspects appeared, and Russia refused extradition requests. The trial was held at The Hague and involved a detailed review of the evidence assembled by Bellingcat and the GIT. Dutch prosecutors presented the complete chain, the launcher's origin at the 53rd Brigade base in Kursk, its transport into Ukraine on a low-loader, its movement through Donetsk, its presence near Pervomaisk on July 17th, and the social media documentation of its return to Russia with 1 missile expended. In November 2022, the court delivered its verdict. 3 of the 4 defendants, Gherkin, Dubinsky and Harkin, were convicted in absentia of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. The conviction was grounded in the court's assessment of the evidence, which included the open-source geolocation work that traced the launcher's journey. For the purposes of the Dutch criminal court, the methodology developed by open-source researchers and subsequently validated by the GITIS was legally sufficient to support a murder conviction. That outcome carries a methodological lesson that extends far beyond this single case. The MH17 investigation demonstrated that open-source evidence gathered from publicly accessible social media posts, satellite imagery and video clips produced by civilian bystanders could be assembled into a chain of accountability meeting the evidentiary standards of a criminal court. This was not a theoretical proposition. It was demonstrated in practice through a process that took 8 years from the date of the crime to the delivery of a verdict. The debris evidence had been decisive in confirming the weapon type long before the trial. Shrapnel recovered from the bodies of MH17 crew members and from the wreckage of the aircraft was identified as fragments of a 9M314M warhead, the warhead type used in the 9M38M1 missile, which is fired from the Buk M1 system. The Dutch Safety Board's technical investigation, completed in October 2015, established this conclusively. The JIT's criminal investigation then traced the missile type back to Russian military stocks and independently geolocated the launch point to the agricultural field near Pervomaisk that Bellingcat had already identified through its own analysis. The investigation also illustrated the specific vulnerabilities that open-source analysis exploits in conflicts involving state military operations in the social media era. Military convoys move through populated areas, people photograph them and share what they see. Those photographs carry metadata, publication timestamps, and cross-referencing possibilities that make them traceable. Governments that attempt to deny the presence of military hardware face an almost impossible challenge in a modern information environment, because the evidence of passage accumulates across thousands of independent observers who have no coordination with each other and no awareness of the investigative significance of what they are capturing. The Buk launcher, designated 332, was photographed at least a dozen times by different people with no connection to each other. Some of those photographs were intended as curiosities, unusual vehicles passing through town. Some were shot by people who sensed something significant without knowing the details. One was posted to social media without captions or explanation. Together, these fragments, assembled by researchers working with publicly available tools and methodological discipline, constituted an evidentiary record that a criminal court found compelling. What made the geolocation chain definitive was not any single image, but the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence. The identifying features of Launcher 332 consistent across sightings in Russia and in Ukraine, the geolocation of each sighting to a specific place and time, the directional logic of the route moving from Russia into Ukraine before the shootdown, and returning with one missile expended. Each element was individually verifiable. Together they formed a structure that could not be explained by coincidence or fabrication. For OSINT methodology, the MH17 investigation established a template that practitioners have since applied to documented events across multiple conflicts. The core elements are replicable. Identify the subject through visual characteristics. Geolocate every available sighting using fixed reference points matched to satellite and mapping data. Reconstruct the timeline through publication metadata and contextual evidence. Cross-reference independent sources to establish corroboration, and document every step transparently so that the work can be checked and challenged. The strength of the conclusion comes from the density and independence of the evidence, not from the authority of any single source. The case also clarified the relationship between open-source investigation and official accountability processes. The GET treated Bellingcat's published work as a starting point for its own investigation, not as a final authority. That relationship, open-source researchers publishing verifiable findings, official investigations conducting parallel work that corroborates or challenges them, has since been replicated in international accountability investigations across multiple countries and contexts. The 4 suspects named by the GET remain outside the reach of Dutch courts. Russia has not extradited them and has continued to maintain that Russian state military hardware was not present in eastern Ukraine in July 2014. A position held against an evidential record assembled largely from images that Russian-speaking residents posted to Russian social media platforms, images those platforms have since partially suppressed but which persist in archived form because they propagated too widely before the deletions. The November 2022 convictions represented a form of closure that is legally real even if the convicted individuals remain free. The Dutch court found, beyond reasonable doubt, based on evidence that included the chain of open-source geolocation linking a specific Buk launcher to a specific Russian military unit and to a specific field in eastern Donetsk, the 3 named individuals bore criminal responsibility for the deaths of 298 people. That finding rests, in part, on a photograph taken through a car window by someone who thought she was simply recording an unusual sight on an ordinary morning. It rests on the analytical work of researchers who developed systematic methods for reading military hardware from social media images. It rests on the convergence of dozens of photographs captured independently by people who had no contact with each other and no awareness of the legal significance of what they were producing. And it rests on a methodology that is public, documented, and reproducible. The lesson for open-source analysts is not primarily about this specific case. It is about what is possible when systematic methods are applied consistently to the evidence that modern information environments produce as a byproduct of ordinary civilian activity. Military operations in populated areas in the social media era generate evidentiary records distributed across thousands of independent observers. The investigative challenge is not to create evidence, but to find, verify, and connect the evidence that already exists. The MH17 investigation showed what that process looks like when it is done rigorously, transparently, and over a sustained period of time. 8 years passed between the date of the crime and the delivery of the verdict. The evidence that would support it had been available in fragments since the morning of July 17, 2014.